Start. Hello, I am Michael Kimmage, the director of the Kennan Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to a conversation today about recent events in Venezuela, an assessment of the Russian response, and I think what will also be a broader conversation about the global implications of what's going on to the extent that we can discern them. And to discern them, we have two wonderful guests today for this Kennan Conversation discussion. We have Stephen Wertheim of the Carnegie Endowment, and we have Hanna Notte, who is a non-resident fellow at the Kennan Institute. Among other things, I could go through a long list of publications and accomplishments, but I think we have a lot of ground to cover. So let those brief introductions suffice for our two terrific speakers. We will go back and forth, the three of us, for about 45 minutes. The audience is very much invited to send questions into the chat function or the question function of this Zoom conversation, and we'll get to those, and have a good half hour for the audience to ask questions. I'd like to start, Stephen, with you, and I think it is important to try to place the capture of Maduro in a broader trajectory of Trump administration foreign policy. Going back, I think it sometimes gets forgotten because there's a lot of attention paid recently to the national security strategy and a lot of attention paid to J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference in February of 2025. But I think what gets a little bit neglected at times is the second inaugural address of President Trump, where he did identify the Western Hemisphere as something of great importance to his administration, and did signal, I think, especially with the reference. I can't resist this, Stephen, because the two of us are historians. The reference to William McKinley, and that, of course, is the era of the Spanish-American War, 1898. When the U.S. acquired, in different forms and fashions, quite a bit of territory in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And clearly there's a clue that resides in that second inaugural address. But I want to begin with a question about context for this and really Trump administration context. There's been a long military buildup in the Caribbean prior to the events of this weekend. It's hard to interpret this event as a kind of accident. It was clearly carefully planned and seems to embody some major initiative on the part of the Trump administration. But I'd like to start there, maybe not so much with the event itself, but the framing for it, the motivations, and from which point within Trump world this set of initiatives originates.
Well, good questions all, and thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and of course to see the Kennan Institute survive and thrive. Less delighted by the proximate trigger for our conversation, but there you have it. Yeah, I mean, going back to the inaugural address, it was maybe Janus-faced. On the one hand, there were the turn of the 20th century or 19th century allusions to McKinley, a claim on Greenland, etc. So we could already see a Western Hemisphere oriented uh, defense approach crystallize in Trump's mind. On the other hand, Trump also said that he would measure success in foreign policy not just by the battles that we win, but more importantly, he said the wars that we never get into. And so I think we see kind of both sides of Trump's balance sheet being played out here in his handling of Venezuela. First of all, I think what we are seeing is Trump finally bringing American foreign policy under his leadership into line with one of his own instincts that he's had all along, which is that the real threats to the security of the United States come from border crossing phenomena, migrants in particular, drugs. And so this Venezuela campaign emerges out of Trump having an administration that finally embraces that view. and that has therefore, without necessarily, backing away from other U.S. commitments or positions around the world, has nevertheless brought the sense of threat that the United States faces to the Western Hemisphere, and to these kinds of threats. And then, of course, uh, uh, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been, I think, very important in shaping the Venezuela policy. So, as in so many other areas where the United States has taken military action, you have different factions with somewhat different agendas, but all they can all align on the campaign to ramp up pressure on Maduro, and now ultimately to capture him from the country and decapitate, although not yet change the regime. Rubio's concern comes more from a focus on longstanding U.S. Adversaries and competitors in the hemisphere, centering on Cuba, not just Venezuela. But that's an agenda that has found common cause now with other parts of the administration, including Stephen Miller, for whom, immigration is his ultimate concern. So I think we're seeing a number of things just to sort of register, though, if we look at the arc of Trump's first term, um, that are worth bearing in mind as we think about how the president might operate in the future. First of all, Trump is growing in confidence and boldness in the use of military force. Just since July, the strikes on Iran, strikes on Syria, strikes on Nigeria, now Venezuela. He has also ordered far more airstrikes, it seems, in his first year than Biden ordered across his 4 years. Um, at the same time, Trump clearly prefers one and done military strikes, going back to the strike on Qasem Soleimani at the end of his first term. The big departure over the weekend with the action in Venezuela is that Trump is trending toward more expansive missions and objectives. He announced this operation by talking about regime change and a new start for the people of Venezuela. Pretty quickly, it appeared that what he may have meant was simply that the United States was going to continue to coerce the regime through an oil embargo and try to pressure it into doing things that the United States wants. We will see. But this greater boldness in the application of military force by Trump, I think, raises the question of where he would go next if he does not uh, run into the kind of long-term military operation in Venezuela that he seems to want to avoid.
I want to linger with that point just for a moment, Stephen, ask you one further question before we turn to Hannah and to shift the conversation over to Russia. And this is something that to me was implicit to your comments of a moment ago that there's a radicalism to Trump's second term. It doesn't seem to me, I would have to go back and look at this because my memory is vague, but it doesn't seem to me that the radicalism was part of the 2024 campaign. I don't recall references to, Canada, to Greenland, indications that there would be such a proactive and, in fact, militarized foreign policy. You can actually find many comments going in a different direction, as you said. Jane has faced with the inaugural address, but the campaign seemed to indicate that this would be a continuation of Trump's first term, and if anything, a kind of doubling down on the restraint ethos that Trump and people around him had articulated at various points, in addition to other, sort of storylines and trajectories that you get from Trump world. Before we turn to Hannah, just a few thoughts about radicalism, because I do think it matters for how Russia responds, not just to Venezuela, but how Russia responds to the United States at this moment. Do you have a sense of what could explain this? You mentioned President Trump's growing self-confidence. That has to be one factor, but I wonder if there aren't other factors that would be pertinent to the conversation.
Well, I think you're right that this is basically a surprise. If you go back to the election, Trump essentially ran on a more restrained military role. Uh, than his opponent. At least that was the uh, message that he attempted to communicate with ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine. His pitch was, I want to bring peace. And he has continued that. And yet, basically, as soon as the election concluded, he then started making these pronouncements about wanting to take Greenland, wanting to take the Panama Canal, uh, maybe wanting to take uh, Canada and make it the 51st state. I think that one has dropped out. But what we've seen over the past year is now, I think, a full-throated um, attempt to reassert the Maduro doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. As Trump said, announcing the operation against Maduro, he wants American dominance of the Western Hemisphere to be unquestioned. You can go back and you can see roots of this thinking in his first term. He expressed acquisitiveness toward Greenland in his first term, but then it went away. And so I think what we're seeing is, you know, he has captured the imaginations of a certain number of Americans with the idea that the United States should again be an expanding country. I think that cannot be discounted. Um, and then he has, on a bureaucratic level, um, identified the Western Hemisphere as an area where the deeply divided elements of his administration, when it comes to foreign policy, more or less converge, or they don't have major objections. And so, I think ever since the boat strikes began over the fall, it's become quite clear that the administration is pursuing a militarized approach to Western Hemisphere affairs, and the Venezuela operation now makes that uh, extremely stark.
So let's turn to Hannah now. Hannah, in one of my least favorite metaphors that was commonly used in November and December of 2024, there was this metaphor of champagne being drunk in Moscow at the election of Donald Trump for a second term. I just wonder how much champagne can these parliamentarians drink, and do they in fact drink champagne? I mean, there's something silly about the metaphor, but I think we're all familiar with the storyline that the second Trump term was, on some level, supposed to be welcomed by Russia. And to be sure, that's been borne out in a couple of instances. You have the Alaska summit, you have, the scaling back of U.S. support for Ukraine, you have severe, crises, degradation of the transatlantic relationship, and one can come up with other factors that might be looked upon in Moscow with appreciation that Trump is somehow shifting over to Russia's side, or that argument is sometimes made. And yet, to go back to Stephen's two prior answers, what we have is a radicalized or radicalizing Trump administration, perhaps, or more radical than in the first term. And we have a Trump administration that is quite comfortable with the application of military power. And it just so happens, by design or by accident, that in two instances, the application of military power against Iran and against Venezuela are, sort of interfering with Russian relationships or hitting states that are, partners of Russia's in some ways. But it would be good before we go on to other countries to start with just Venezuela itself. And I was hoping you could provide a bit of context there, and then just take us through your understanding of the Russian response over the last 72 hours. Definitely no champagne being drunk in Moscow, as far as I can tell. But as you've written on social media, a kind of muted and mixed and somewhat subdued response. I'm very curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, happy to, Michael, and it's great to be with you and Stephen today. So I think the first thing to say here is that this is a situation in Venezuela that Russia could not have prevented. It could not have conceivably really interfered militarily to prevent this kind of outcome. If Russia could not do much for Iran last summer, if Russia could not prevent the Assad regime from collapsing in Syria in late 2024, certainly for reasons of geography and logistics, Russia could not save Maduro. And so Venezuela was not Russia's to give. We've seen some sort of commentary on social media that was perhaps a sort of Russia stands down in Venezuela and therefore expects Trump to give Russia a preferable deal in Ukraine, sort of that kind of bargaining or deal making, I think is not really apt for the situation because Venezuela was not Russia's to give. Maduro was an important partner for Putin in the Western Hemisphere. There's been an important oil relationship over the years. Venezuela has bought Russian weapons over the years. He was, I think, a convenient partner in this broader geopolitical standoff with the West. Maduro came to the BRICS summit in Kazan in October 2024. He came to the Victory Day parade in Moscow last year. So there was this value to the relationship. But the relationship is not that important to Russia. Certainly, it pales in comparison to other priorities with regards to the war in Ukraine. So that just sort of as a starting point here. Now, if we look at the Russian reaction to what just happened, we've certainly seen the condemnation by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, most, fiercely, I would say, Vasily Nebenzia on the UN Security Council yesterday, who called American actions a form of neocolonialism. I think if you look at the Russian expert community and especially the military bloggers, there are some other reactions mixed in there. I would say even a certain begrudging admiration for what the Americans managed to pull off, both with Operation Midnight Hammer against Iran last summer, but then also with this swift operation against Maduro, a sort of, almost envy and sense that, well, we wish that we could pull off something like this. And we certainly weren't able to pull off a quick victory in Ukraine when we went in there in February 2022. But let me make two broad points here on the Russian reaction as I see it and what I also expect going forward, Michael. And the first theme I want to start with is the idea of adaptation. This is not the first time that the Russian Federation is faced with an undesirable situation that it could not prevent, and it will now move to adapt to it in order to salvage its influence and interests to the best of its abilities. I actually think that in the Russian reaction, there's a bit of a parallel here to a situation that was really quite different in many respects, but it's the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. This was a situation that Russia could not prevent. It didn't have the resources or the power projection. It was opposed to the invasion, but once it happened, the Russians were actually less vocal in their criticism than some other countries, and they pivoted quite quickly to accommodate the US in order to safeguard their interests in a post-Saddam Iraq, especially in the oil sector. And this was also a time when the Russians had a broader bilateral agenda with the United States. This is still a time when, yes, the Americans had abrogated the ABM treaty. There were some tensions building in the US-Russia relationship, but there were still things that the Russians were hoping to get from the Americans. And so they were actually fairly subdued in their criticism. So there's maybe something to be gleaned from that episode. Another situation where Russia has moved quite fast to turn adversity into opportunity was when the Assad regime fell in Syria. Now, this was a situation that wasn't brought about by US military action. It's a different kind of scenario, but still over the course of the last year, Russia has hustled quite intensively in order to safeguard its interests. And 1 year on, we are in a situation where they have not been ousted from their bases in Syria, even though we've had a complete overhaul of the Syrian regime. And so in Venezuela, I expect very much the same. Russia will try to safeguard its interests. Foreign Minister Lavrov already spoke with Delcy Rodriguez on January 3rd, very soon after the events. I've seen footage of the Russian ambassador appearing at her swearing-in ceremony yesterday, embracing her. So I think Russia has the relationships on the ground with Venezuelan actors in order to try to safeguard its interests. A second theme, leaving aside this kind of adaptation, is, and I want to return to this notion of Janus faced. I think Russia is actually now in a bit of an interesting bind of its own making. It has to balance between, on the one hand, the appeal of criticizing the United States internationally, which is a very attractive proposition right now, because arguably the US is engaged in a form of neo-colonial venture, Trump saying we want the oil. And Russia has built its entire strategic foreign policy narrative over the last 3.5 years on this notion that Russia is leading what it calls the global majority in an anti-neo-colonial fight. And so I think this is why you saw Russia at the UN Security Council yesterday tapping into this notion of neo-colonialism. So that's very attractive to Russia right now. But then there is a countervailing interest, which is the desire to stay in Trump's good graces. If you look at Putin and then the Kremlin over the past year, since Trump's inauguration, Putin has refrained from criticizing a single Trumpian major foreign policy initiative over the last year. If we look at the strikes on Iran last summer, Putin was actually very even-handed in his rhetoric, even though Iran was an ally. He's praised Trump's initiative on the war in Gaza and the Sharm el-Sheikh summit that happened in the fall. And now I'm not surprised at all to find that by January 6th today, we haven't actually heard from Putin or from the Kremlin. We're seeing Russian diplomacy criticizing what is happening, but we're not seeing it coming from the Kremlin. So we're almost seeing the sort of bifurcated Russian rhetoric, which again actually echoes what happened in the summer. The Russian MFA was quite visceral in its criticism of the US operation against Iran, but Putin wasn't. And the reason, of course, is that Ukraine is Russia's utmost priority. And I think we're still currently in an environment in which Putin hopes to, at a minimum, string Trump along, not antagonize him, not get sort of on his wrong side, so that he wins further time either to meet his maximalist demands in Ukraine on the battlefield or in a settlement that is preferable to Russia. And so we have this curious situation to me where this is now the perfect moment for Russia to go all in with its sort of global anti-neo-colonial narrative. But I think that Russia will not ride the wave as much as it could, and other states will maybe be more forthcoming in this kind of criticism because Putin will not want to antagonize Trump.
Great. I'm going to follow up, Hanna, with you with one question about Ukraine, and then we'll turn with a similar question to Stephen. Not that this is easy to piece together in any way. Venezuela and Ukraine are quite far apart from each other on the map. And I'll phrase the question this way. You could argue, speculating, of course, about what may happen the next couple of months, that Venezuela and Ukraine are just two different problem sets. And what happens in Venezuela, and it's possible that it will be less dramatic than we expect, that it could just be a long period of muddle, simply may not influence the logic of negotiations such as it is at the present moment. Or if the U.S. does get bogged down in Ukraine, or rather, the U.S. gets bogged down in Venezuela, which does seem quite possible to me, that too will not have much of an impact because the U.S. isn't providing a great deal of aid at this stage to Ukraine. So you could separate the two problem sets and say, Ukraine will follow its path as a foreign policy issue, and Venezuela will follow its path. Or you could argue that there will be some kind of link between the two. And I think implicit to your comments, Hanna, is that in the Russian purview, there's something of a link, at least in the sense that Russia doesn't want to screw up by overdoing it with criticizing the Trump administration in Venezuela, because the Kremlin is expecting some kind of deal to take place in Ukraine. It wants, of course, the support or the buy-in or a permissive environment that the United States might help to create for negotiations. And so there is kind of a linkage. But very curious, Hanna, how you see this, how this might get linked. And let's stay in your case, sort of within the Russian purview, and then, Stephen, we can speculate about a few other potential purviews here. But in the Russian approach over the next couple of months, do you think that there'll be a strong linkage, a weak linkage, or perhaps no linkage at all between these two different problem sets?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael. And I guess, to sort of assess what this all means for Ukraine and the negotiations, we can parse this problem set in different ways. It's also what does this do to European intent? What does it do to the Ukrainians? But let's perhaps start with Russia and with Trump, which are, I think, the most important variables here. So since you asked me to start with with Russia, I think that there's sort of two questions to ask, really regarding both Putin and Trump. Does what just happened in Venezuela and what continues to happen shape their intent as regards the whole Ukraine problem set? And does it shape their capabilities? So if you start with the Russian side, in terms of Russian intent, which I characterized as, I mean, I view Russia's demands vis-à-vis Ukraine to continue to be maximalist, essentially a subjugation of Ukraine. I have not seen any indication that that intent on the Russian side has changed. I don't see this being changed by the situation in Venezuela. Um, I think, if anything, you could make the argument that with each further geopolitical setback that Russia suffers, and we can tell a story from Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh in 2023 to sort of reduced cloud in Central Asia and the South Caucasus more broadly to setbacks in the Middle East, where I would argue overall Russia's strategic position has eroded, to now what's happened in Venezuela. So a reduced geopolitical cloud for the sake of Putin's obsession with Ukraine, in order for that to be worth it for Russia, you really have to come out on top in Ukraine. Because I do think there's a sort of realization on the Russian side that if they ever want to restore their influence in these other regions, they have to win the war in Ukraine, however they define that. And so, if anything, I think it hardens the Russian resolve on Ukraine. I don't think it really shifts the Russian capabilities here in a meaningful way, what just happened in Venezuela. But I mean, let me come to Trump and the US, because I think this is the important counterpart here. And I'm curious to hear Stephen on this. But, does this operation in Venezuela forebode a Trumpian shift in intent on Ukraine? So far, the statements that we've seen from the US president do not indicate that that is the case. I think he said at a news conference shortly after the operation that he wasn't too thrilled with Putin, who continues to kill many Ukrainians. I think he's echoed the CIA's conclusion that Ukraine was not responsible for targeting Putin's residence. We're still waiting to see the outcomes of the talks in Paris between the coalition of the willing and Ukraine today, but I'm seeing some indication that the US is expressing a readiness to support a European-led post-ceasefire defense force, though I guess we need to wait and see what that really means. But let me make sort of a fundamental point here, Michael. This whole idea that Trump, because he's now claiming and acting upon that claim to a Western Hemisphere sphere of influence, will make him somehow grant a sphere of influence to Putin in Europe, that's just not obvious to me, notwithstanding all the antagonistic and hostile rhetoric vis-à-vis Europe that is coming out of certain camps in the White House. On the capability or resources side, I guess that's where the longevity and the nature of what the US is actually going to do in Venezuela does matter, because I could see that a prolonged military campaign in Venezuela could sort of create a problem of military supplies, but also of political attention or bandwidth. But I don't see that yet either, and so I'm not so sure that this will have such a meaningful impact on Ukraine negotiations.
Well, Hanna, you've provided the perfect segue for a question for Stephen, who throughout his career has written on issues of U.S. primacy, sort of aspirational and actual liberal internationalism, spheres of influence, all of these notions. Stephen, if we could sort of still circle back to the question of Ukraine, maybe we could pick up one of the arguments that Hannah summarized, which is that we now live in a kind of anarchic world. China, Russia, the United States are all carving out spheres of influence, and this dynamic is something that innately benefits Putin. Certainly, that argument has been made repeatedly over the course of the last 3 days. We know from Hannah that she finds the argument, sort of unpersuasive. But I'm curious how you read this. Clearly, what's happened in Venezuela, I wouldn't want to overstate it. It's an event among other important events that are happening at the moment, but it does t tell us something about international order, and it does illuminate what feels, I think, to many of us like a new rhythm to international order. First of all, I'm curious if you would agree with that, but secondly, how might you relate that new rhythm to negotiations over concluding the war in Ukraine?
Great. Well, I thought Hannah is quite right in everything that she said, really. So I'll provide a mere footnote. I think some analysts are overreading or incorrectly interpreting Trump's uh, explicit claim to assert a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Um, to them, that implies that Trump is willing to allow a sphere of influence to Russia in Eastern Europe, or Russia's near abroad, and to China in Asia. Um, I don't think that's how Trump sees it. Um, uh, the sort of normal hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy prior to Trump is that the United States claims a sphere of influence to more or less degrees, you might say. But the United States has for a long time claimed a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, and also attempted to deny a sphere of influence to other major powers in their own regions. Now, if you believe fully in the notion that instead there has been a universal rules-based order, then that's not the way you see it. And so then you may be inclined to say, well, Trump is doing away with that and replacing it with a sphere of influence logic to the world. But I in fact think that that's not the only or best way to interpret what preceded Donald Trump. And I think it's, evident from his own actions to date that he is not backing away from U.S. positions fundamentally, including treaty allies, either in Europe or in Asia. Although, of course, that possibility remains that he might do so. So, spheres of influence for me, but not for thee, I think is the most likely trajectory of U.S. foreign policy, both under Trump for the rest of his term and in the future. Okay, having said that, there is a larger question here beyond U.S. intentions and U.S. policy, and that is, where is the international order going? And that's what you're getting at, Michael. And there, I think there is a somewhat better case to be made that the world is moving towards major powers being able to coerce countries in their near abroad as they define it. And so, it seems certainly quite likely that Russia will walk away from its invasion of Ukraine with a chunk of Ukraine. And it may actually hurt its influence in the rest of its near abroad, but that will be a dramatic result of Putin's full-scale invasion. Um, and over time, it may be that the United States, um, you know, tries to back away from its entanglements overseas. In fact, I think one cause of the turn that we've now seen in the second Trump administration toward a military focus on the Western Hemisphere might be the perception that the United States has lost influence. It has lost a position of primacy overseas, and that the United States should have dominance, at least somewhere. And so the place to now assert American dominance is the Western Hemisphere. So one of the very causes, structural causes of the turn to the hemisphere by the United States, you know, may suggest that the world is heading toward, you could call it greater multipolarity, or you could call it greater great power dominance over spheres. But then I think the question again is, what do those spheres actually look like? How extensive are they? And in Russia's case, they're maybe quite limited.
So I'm intrigued by what you say. Stephen, about this kind of multipolarity. I'm going to turn to you, Hanna, in a moment with a question about Russia that comes from our audience. Delighted to see all of these questions funneling into our Q&A box, and please keep them coming. Clearly there's a lot to ask about. Um, I have a sense that there is something of a convergence, China, Russia, the US, but it's not a convergence on spheres of influence exactly. There's maybe more coherence to spheres of influence that I'm able to detect in the contemporary environment. What I sense, and it's a kind of simple way of putting the point, is that both, or rather, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump all wish to make the rules in their own way. There has been a shifting away either from the reality or the illusion of universal rules that apply across the board. I guess that would be some alternative to multipolarity. And instead, with the invasion of Ukraine, Putin is clearly signaling that he's going to write the rules, as he would put it, in his neighborhood. I think there, President Trump is quite similar. And Xi Jinping is a little bit more difficult to fit into that model. But there is, and I think you can go through actually through middle powers at the moment and see a similar impulse also to write rules in their own fashion, kind of do a broader analysis of this. But I want to return, Hannah, to you. You had mentioned there's something ironic about this, that we're living in the world in part that Putin said he wanted, a world of multipolarity, a world where, military force and audacity on some level have an important function, more so than process and deliberation and the kinds of things that one might stereotypically associate with the European Union. But it's not working out particularly well for Putin. So he's kind of gotten the world that he said that he wanted. That world has arrived, and it's proving much more difficult for him to navigate. And so I want to fold into that a question that came from our audience about whether Putin feels validated in his invasion of Ukraine by what's just happened between the U.S. And Venezuela. So I suppose it could be a two-part question, Hannah, whether there's that sense of validation that he was sort of waiting for the approval that comes from at least the argument you can make of an American president behaving in the way that the Russian president has behaved, but sort of beyond that, just to tease out a few more of the ironies that you were describing a moment ago, the ironies of what I think we could perhaps agree on as a more anarchic world. And yet, that doesn't seem to be a world in which Russia is thriving, either on the battlefields of Ukraine or more broadly. That's the question. Very eager to get your thoughts.
Yeah, well, before I'm coming to the core of your question, let me just come back to something you just said, Michael, which is that Putin wants a world in which military force counts, as opposed to a world in which rules and process matter. That's not actually what Russia is saying. We know that Russia wants a world in which might is right, but Russia, as a matter of official rhetoric, actually insists very much that rules and process and right matter, right? There's this sort of Putin-esque obsession with legalistic argumentation. That's why you see Russian diplomats being so savvy and so well prepared on the UN Security Council. When Russia walks away from arms control agreements, for example, the New START Treaty suspending its participation a couple of years ago, Russia goes out of its way to provide legalistic and procedural justifications for what it's doing. So Russia does not want to appear like the bully that doesn't care about the international rules. Russia is actually quite concerned with paying lip service to them or pretending that the rules do matter. That just sort of as an aside in terms of how Russia wants to present itself to global public opinion. Now we can have a separate conversation as to, who sees through those Russian argumentations and to what extent they matter. But I do think it's worth stating. Now, when we come to the ironies for Russia here, and, does Russia now feel vindicated? Does Putin feel vindicated? I mean, of course, in some sense, you can argue that the way that Trump is now conducting American foreign policy, this sort of thuggish predatory behavior, the operation in Venezuela, threatening to take on Greenland next, makes it easier for Russia to make certain arguments in the court of international public opinion. Actually, we didn't need to wait until this Venezuela operation. I think in many ways, the war in Gaza and what happened in Gaza allowed Russia to neutralize a certain amount of criticism of its own war in Ukraine, given by how this war was seen by parts of the international community. So this is not sort of the first instance that allows Russia to point to other countries' double standards or hypocrisy. And so Russia can well make this argument, see what others are doing. The problem that I see for Russia is, what good does it do Russia if it doesn't sort of win in Ukraine? Yes, it can point to US conduct and criticize it. And yes, it can style itself to be this anti-neocolonial vanguard, as it has tried to do for the last 3.5 years, essentially making this argument that Russia will lead what it calls the global majority into some different kind of international order. The problem for Russia is that it's all rhetoric. Russia cannot put anything against this US conduct, not when the Iranians were hit last summer, now not in Venezuela. So this is sort of the irony for Russia, that it has this grand anti-neocolonial narrative, but US conduct sort of pokes a hole into it. It's rhetoric first and foremost, and not much beyond. And now the Russians are not even going to fully instrumentalize it and exploit it either, because they have other interests to pursue with the United States. So this is sort of one discursive pillar of Russian foreign policy where I think there's a bit of an issue. And there's other areas too, I think. I think the predominant narrative that we have is that MAGA foreign policy is good for Russia because its hostility towards Europe, its emphasis on anti-wokeness, on conservative values, brings it into closer alignment with Russia. But again, here, I think there's a different way to look at this. You could make the argument that with the United States emerging on the international scene as an anti-woke, as a conservative player that says that it cares about Christians in South Africa, for instance, or that, Stephen noted the strikes against ISIS in Nigeria, where Trump specifically referred to Christians being killed by whites. You are stepping onto territory that used to be the prerogative of Vladimir Putin. Putin styled himself to be this, for Russia to be the conservative, the Christian, the anti-woke power. This is how Russia managed to appeal, for instance, in South Africa, both to the ANC and to sort of the anti-imperialists, but also to the white Christian nationalists. And suddenly Russia has competition in the United States, which taps into the same space, which wants to resettle white Afrikaners in the United States when Russia has tried to resettle them in Russia for the last few years. So this is just another area, I think, where you can see that what Trump and US foreign policy stands for in the world is not just good for Russia. The final area that I'd point to is Russia has claimed of itself to be a Eurasian power over the last few years. This is a long-standing trope in Russian foreign policy discourse, but it became even more important since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and this harsh Russian decoupling from Europe, Russia saying it is a Eurasian power. But the United States is not really receding from Eurasia. If you look at Trump in 2025, he hosted the Central Asian leaders for a summit at the White House to great fanfare, announcing economic deals. He hosted the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan last summer to make a peace agreement. So this is a situation where actually the US is paying newfound attention, I would say, to what Russia would consider Greater Eurasia, certainly on the economic front. Now, what is true and what does worry me is that the US cares less about the domestic trajectories of those countries. And so what that might mean is that their leaderships will find that they have greater leeway in the upcoming years to emulate Russian-style authoritarianism. And that will effectively benefit Russia. But I do still think that these countries, even after an end of the war in Ukraine, will not sort of fully fold back into a Russian sphere of influence. They've done their best to diversify their ties away from Russia over the last 3.5, almost 4 years. And I think that is a process that will continue. So Trump is not even good for Russia claiming to be a Eurasian power either.
And I would isolate one detail from the rather remarkable New York Times story by Adam Entus on in Adam Entus's word, the unraveling of the relationship between Ukraine and the U.S. In the second Trump term, which is the role of the CIA in figuring out some technological aspect of Russian oil refineries and then providing Ukraine with the means to make attacks or assisting with the attacks on Russian territory in what we've all witnessed in the last couple of months are these attacks on the Russian oil refineries. Obviously, there are other the policy is moving in other directions, as described in that piece as well. Sort of curtailing of direct military aid to Ukraine. But that detail did jump out to me and just suggested to me that the overall picture is sometimes more complicated than than we give it credit for being, and that the headaches that the Trump administration is creating for Russia may be underestimated in some respects. But Stephen, and we have almost as many questions in our box as we have audience members, which is fabulous. I'm going to cull a point from a few questions and turn it your way. So a number of our audience members have asked about China and where China might fit in this pattern. It seems to me that, of course, there are many differences between Russia and Chinese foreign policy, but one of the objective differences vis-a-vis Venezuela is that China has a fairly significant energy relationship with Venezuela, and therefore the repercussions of this may be a bit more immediate or more tangible in the Chinese case than in the Russian case. But if you could offer us some guidance on how to connect the China piece of the puzzle to an already quite complicated puzzle, that would be great.
Well, I think we could probably make a somewhat similar analysis vis-a-vis China than the one we've discussed toward Russia, which is that even though rhetorically Donald Trump has backed off of adversarial language toward China in his first term, the actions themselves have not necessarily benefited China's interests. Perhaps the opposite. Even in the national security strategy, which was remarkable for dropping a great power competition or strategic competition framing toward China. The content of it suggested that the United States is claiming every right to roll back Chinese influence, including all manner of economic influence from the Western Hemisphere. When it came to Asia, uh, the document didn't say terribly much, but it had very specific language on Taiwan that suggested a high degree of strategic investment by the Trump administration in Taiwan. So I think we should be careful not to mistake, Trump's own personal language and how he frames relationships with the kinds of actions that can detrimentally affect the wide-ranging interests of China and to a lesser extent um, Russia. So, certainly China, it's a setback, the U.S. strike on Venezuela. Although Trump did say that he aims to get more oil flowing from Venezuela and that oil could continue to be sold to China. So we'll have to see. It's also an embarrassment for China that its diplomats, had met in the country with government officials shortly before the strike, um, which China didn't see coming. Although I think it would have been, very hard for any foreign intelligence to understand the exact timing and nature of these strikes. But just to go back to your really stimulating question, Michael, on sort of how the three powers, the United States, Russia, and China, relate to international rules. Uh, I might put it like this. I mean, Trump doesn't care about rules. In fact, he delights in being the situational arbiter of everything, even if he's not really the arbiter. That's the image he likes to project. Um, Russia doesn't have the power to make rules. It has the power to spoil, so it's able to sort of evade any kind of responsibility and pay lip service to rules while clearly breaking them in its own conduct. China is now, at this moment in time, the of the three powers, the power that is most interested in a rules-based order. Of course, it's one that favors China. But China, I think, has seized the opportunity in the second Trump administration to put forward a messaging that, emulates the United States post 1945, suggesting that China is going to be a good steward of international law and order. And so, Trump's thuggery helps, I think, China and Russia criticize the United States in the court of international public opinion. China and Russia can benefit from pointing out American hypocrisy, but even China, I think, doesn't want to be put in the position of saying, we accept this implicit bargain that, the United States will do what it likes in the Americas, China will do what it likes in Asia. That is not, in fact, the offer that the United States is making, nor is it the way that China, for the most part, tries to present itself to its own neighbors.
Great. The audience also has a few questions about Cuba, which I will turn to Hannah in terms of again where things may trend. I think, and this goes back to something that Stephen said earlier about this being the moment of Marco Rubio. That's I think a very sustainable argument that he certainly emerged for the time being, perhaps as the dominant figure in policy formation after the president. And it's clear if you look back to Senator Rubio's career and the kind of the long arc of his engagement with foreign policy that Cuba is a very important issue. He has family heritage there, and it's undoubtedly the case that for Secretary Rubio, Venezuela and Cuba are linked. And of course, there's an energy relationship and a kind of security relationship, political relationship between Venezuela and Cuba. And so let's just accept as a premise. I, don't know how, valid this premise is that there might be some kind of move made in the next couple of months, parallel to the one made in Venezuela over the past weekend on Cuba from the United States. And the inevitable question is how Russia would prepare for this, look upon this, assess this. Because as with Venezuela, of course, Russia has an important relationship with Cuba. This was in the Cold War, the site of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think that that's really relevant information, but it is to say that there is, kind of a long history behind this as well. So, where do you think Cuba might fit in this evolving story? And no doubt there are conversations now in Moscow about how to conceptualize Cuba in the kind of Caribbean Western Hemisphere policy of the Trump administration and what perhaps to do about it.
Yeah, not an expert on Russia-Cuba relations, but let me try to take this question. I mean, my starting point would be um, I will accept your premise that the US would move against Cuba, but I do think it's worth pointing out that if that were to happen, it wouldn't fit the predatory, resource-driven, extraction-minded pattern that explained, I think, at least to a great extent, what just happened with Venezuela or the kind of eyeing of Greenland or Canada, because, Cuba is not as attractive a target in terms of resources as Venezuela. So it would then be more through the regime change lens, as I suppose. And so I think there's a question worth asking how likely that is. We can have the same conversation about US possible intervention against Iran, by the way, which a lot of people are now speculating about whether we might see something happen on that in 2026, which would again have to be explained through an entirely different prism than what we just saw with Venezuela. But staying with Cuba for a moment, yes, this is another important partner of Russia in the Western Hemisphere. We've seen over the last few years I think the Russian Navy dock there, weapons have been sold there. I think the Russians tried to re-erect their listening station in Cuba after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But again, if sort of power projection towards Venezuela was limited, the same is certainly true for Cuba. It's an important partner to Russia, but I don't really see what the Russians could do for Cuba if they weren't able to really do anything for Venezuela. I think the cases where we've seen Russian passivity or impotence over the last 2, 3 years, again, Syria, Iran, those are actually much more important to Russia because in the Middle East, Russia actually has a strategic position that it cares about and that it has invested a great deal in over the last decade or so. And Russia decided to stand aside. So I mean, I don't really see how, assuming a continuation of the war against Ukraine, if something were to happen in Cuba over the upcoming period, how we would see sort of, Russia moving in order to assist the Cubans.
If I could jump in with another question here, Hannah, and then we'll turn back to Stephen in a moment. We haven't spoken much in this conversation about Europe. Obviously, it's it's sort of a Russia, Venezuela, U.S. conversation. But it seems to me, Hannah, that and one of the reasons that Putin would be reluctant to be very critical of Trump at the moment, sort of on the premise, I can't remember which strategic thinker said this, Sun Tzu or somebody in that vein, but you don't interfere with your opponent when the opponent is screwing up. And so we saw that quite quickly after the events this past weekend in Venezuela, there was a tweet, I believe, or social media posting from Stephen Miller's wife about superimposing an American flag onto Greenland. And then President Trump himself, in a string of associations, then echoed in press statements from Stephen Miller himself, seemed to link the move in Venezuela to a potential move. Actually, Canada did come kind of back into the picture after being out of the picture for a while, but certainly, sort of Greenland slash Denmark. There have been, really dozens of comments from the Trump administration over the past couple of days about this being, part of this trajectory. I think it goes back to the earlier part of the conversation about the radicalism of Trump's foreign policy. But it does seem to me that Europe is in a great bind at the moment, and it's not so much about rule of law and having the right press statements about what happened in Venezuela. That I think is secondary, but it's sort of where's this radical foreign policy of Washington's going to go next, and is Europe going to fall in the crosshairs in one way or another of kind of new thinking in Washington? But I just wanted to ask about the European piece here because it does seem from a Russian vantage point that this would be utterly a dream come true. That if you would have an inner NATO conflict of either a diplomatic or a military nature, then the whole efficacy of NATO becomes dramatically less, and certain things, become thinkable, I think, in Russia that were just unthinkable 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael. And I think, if I think about the Greenland bit here, the Trumpian threats vis-a-vis Europe more broadly, what was written in the national security strategy, from looking at Russian reactions and debates, and I haven't seen anything actually specifically in response to these latest developments on Greenland yet. But more broadly, I see sort of two dimensions in how Russians are reacting to this. I think there is a certain concern over MAGA foreign policy as being a make America great again foreign policy. And ultimately, this is aimed at America still being the greatest country in the world. This is not about sharing the world and the spoils with Russia and China. This is the Americans will do as they please, and they're still aspiring to be the world's hegemon. And so I think there is a certain element here of looking at concern at this, we call it radical Trumpian foreign policy, even if it is potentially directed against Europe, because I think there is a certain contingent in Moscow that wonders, will this eventually be directed against us as well? Will this be directed against our own interests? Now, having said that, I do fully agree with you that there's also a welcoming of this radical foreign policy being directed against Europe. I mean, anything that weakens NATO from within, that makes the alliance more corrosive, that leads to the Europeans freaking out and having yet to deal with another problem, and therefore also distracting perhaps away from Ukraine, is obviously welcome from the Russian point of view. I think the ideal scenario for Russia, of course, is that it will never have to contemplate going to war against NATO, because NATO will just collapse from the inside by political disputes that Russia, through its actions, might try to fuel and might try to ignite, but that is the outcome that you ultimately hope for, as opposed to needing to find a military solution to the NATO problem. And so, in this sense, this new wrench that's being thrown by Stephen Miller and others, and you see the Europeans being very alarmed and sort of scrambling to find a response, I think is certainly welcome from the Kremlin's point of view.
Could I ask something similar of you, Stephen, maybe in a less Kremlin-focused way, sort of the transatlantic relationship in the shadow of the events of the last week? And of course, we could go back to the national security strategy and the Vance speech and the second inaugural here as well. But I myself struggle a lot analytically to separate what does seem to me often like hyperbole and infighting within the Trump administration and signaling to the American population and, kind of media theatrics on the one hand, from genuine and true shifts in American foreign policy on the other. But the problem with the theater argument that some of this stuff is primarily theater is precisely what happened in Venezuela a couple of days ago. That's not theater. I mean, it's that too, but it's not only theater. It's something that really shifted on the ground. So is the transatlantic relationship at risk of something, sort of fundamentally breaking because of this? Or does that strike you as hyperbole? My mind goes in both directions on this point consistently or inconsistently.
Me too. I do think right now it does look to me like the transatlantic relationship is at risk. And I think the main reason is the possibility of a US move to take Greenland or force Greenland to be given up by Denmark. Um, so even absent the Greenland issue, we have sort of two approaches by the administration that are somewhat in conflict. One, the attempt to have Europeans take more ownership of their security, which so far has not involved the United States withdrawing many military resources from Europe. I mean, I don't actually expect that that will happen in the coming years, unless the United States needs those assets for a contingency elsewhere, which could very well happen. On the other hand, parts of the administration also seek to change European politics from within. From the Munich speech to the national security strategy, we don't know quite where that's going, but it hasn't, it has appeared in the national security strategy. It appears in the actions and speech of American diplomats in Europe. And that agenda has real legs, and it cuts across purposes with the agenda of empowering Europeans, because it suggests that at least for a while, the United States will try to promote European disunity. But on top of this is a potential forcing event, which would be Greenland. And I think the risk to the entire transatlantic relationship would come if the United States makes a coercive campaign against Greenland. European governments have to take positions on this. And so that's where you could see the countries in Eastern Europe who are most concerned about the Russia threat and who are most comfortable with Washington being their security guarantor, potentially being unwilling to stand up to the United States, whereas other countries may feel compelled that they need to do that. And that's the kind of thing where, if Vladimir Putin is thinking that there's a real prospect of a transatlantic rift in the near future, maybe he wants to, um, you know, let that happen. Uh, and that could cause him to sort of, I think, double down on an approach of, trying to string along Trump, not get on his bad side, but not necessarily take the risk of ending the war in Ukraine. It's very hard to say how all this will play out with respect to Ukraine, but I do think the prospect of a sharp transatlantic breakdown is as great as it's been at any point in the Trump era.
Yeah, I would add to that in the spirit of what I find in both of your comments, a credible alarmism on these points, that a transatlantic and simultaneously a European fragmentation is quite possible. If you look at the statements of Slovakia's Fico and Hungary's Viktor Orban, they were sort of admiring in some ways of U.S. actions over the weekend. Most other European leaders were kind of struggling not to be too critical, but obviously not happy. And then Viktor Orban indicated that Greenland could be adjudicated within NATO, that there could be some territorial adjustment made within NATO, which I suspect is not going to happen, but is an interesting linkage on the European side of Venezuela and Greenland. And of course, Orban is obviously very much in the minority in that viewpoint within Europe. But the fragmentation could be simultaneous. And I think, even though I fully agree with you, Stephen, that we can't spell out what that would mean for Ukraine in the short to medium term, none of it is good news for Ukraine if it becomes, less theatrical and more serious. One final question for you, Stephen, and one final question. I'll give the last question to Hanna. These are two separate questions, and I think they sort of speak to different interests of yours. So, for you, Stephen, this is a very interesting hypothetical, and this is whether Putin could cross a threshold and somehow antagonize Trump, and we could have a kind of U.S.-Russian geopolitical crisis that would be instigated by Putin's actions. I'll just add into this, I noted in the last couple of days that Pete Hegseth had some mocking comments about Russian air defenses, which I don't think were really directed toward Russia. I think it was more, a kind of chest thumping set of comments about American power. But nevertheless, one could imagine something like that happening, I suppose. And so the questioner is asking you to play that out and to speculate about that. The status quo is so thin at the moment in so many respects that it's a good time to think about hypotheticals.
Well, yeah, well, with Trump, the tail risks on the distribution of outcomes seem quite high in either direction with respect to Ukraine. So I still think that there is a possibility that if Trump uh, lands in a decisive way on blaming Putin for the failure of negotiations, um, then he can find ways to turn up the heat on Russia. And now that he has shown a trend toward being bolder and unconventional in the use of military force, who knows where that leads? And that has got to be something on the mind of people in the Kremlin. And so, maybe this strike over the weekend also provides some degree of incentive for Putin to think about getting out of this situation. And moreover, maximizing his opportunity, his upside opportunity with the Trump administration, which is a wasting asset. If he stops the war in Ukraine now, he's got 3 years to do something positive in U.S.-Russian relations with Donald Trump. If he continues it, maybe he loses that opportunity altogether, and in fact is put back on his heels by an unpredictable Donald Trump. So I think that is a real possibility, and yet I think it would still take a lot for Putin to, land on Trump's bad side, given the really strong reluctance that Trump has showed to take risks with respect to Ukraine and incur real costs there.
I mean, there's a certain symmetry to what you're describing, Stephen, when I hear you describe it, which is that I believe one of the factors in the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russia's 2022 invasion, is that Putin thought that he was on a roll in the use of military force, from annexation of Crimea to the incursion into Syria, and beyond. I wouldn't, in any crude way, apply that analogy to the Trump administration, but it is interesting to note leaders when they think that they're on a roll, which I think is clearly the case with President Trump at the moment, and what that may portend. And so the final question for you, Hanna, from our audience, and if it's a bit too specific, then please just offer us your sort of concluding general reflections on the topic. But it's an interesting question about oil prices and oil in Venezuela and potential problems for the Russian economy. I guess the assumption being that if in the next year or two, Venezuela is returned in some more robust way to global markets, perhaps with the assistance of American firms, that this could drive down the price of oil. And that, of course, matters for the Russian budget and the kind of the Russian economic bottom line. There was, I'll just note in passing, an interesting, can't remember if it was a tweet or sort of exactly where it came from, but comments from Oleg Deripaska, who is a Russian oligarch, and he was quite critical of the Kremlin that these developments in Venezuela are going to give the U.S. control over a lot of the world's oil supplies, and that this is going to be very negative for Russia, and that's a reason to reconsider the fighting of the war in Ukraine. So that's just a somewhat random comment, but there you kind of see that linkage between, let's put it this way in very general terms, mounting economic problems. I think that that's fair to say for Russia, and perhaps Venezuela or other developments contributing to them, and what that could mean. So to close us out, that's the question.
Sure. And if I may, I'll just have a quick addition to Stephen's response to your previous question about Putin potentially really antagonizing Trump. I think the closest example that we've seen of Putin really upsetting Trump over the last year is whenever the Russians engage in what I would call nuclear bravado. So when reports emerged of the Russians having tested the Burevestnik cruise missile and the Poseidon underwater torpedo, so what we call Russia's super weapons or novel weapons, Trump didn't react particularly well. He then announced that the US might resume nuclear testing, and it caused a whole kind of debate and anxiety in the nuclear arms control community in terms of what Trump meant and whether the US was actually going to move back to nuclear testing. So I think, and there was a previous instance where Trump had reacted poorly to Dmitry Medvedev, the previous Russian president, engaging in some kind of nuclear saber rattling on social media. So this is kind of, I think, an area where Trump can be quite prickly when it comes to reacting to the Russians. But again, I would agree with Stephen that I find it hard to conceive that this reaction would sort of go overboard and really let the US administration sort of fully change its position on Ukraine. I find that hard to conceive. Now to the oil market question, without being an expert on the oil markets, I mean, from what I understand from the situation, there is actually an expectation that in the short term, the situation could benefit Russia because Venezuela has sold such a huge amount of oil to the Chinese, and the Chinese might therefore turn to Russia for yet more oil, at least in the short to medium term period. So this could actually benefit Russia by selling more oil to China. And this notion that the Venezuelan oil industry could reconstitute and sort of could flood the market, and that this could lead to lower prices and sort of harm Russian interests, from what I understand, at least from people who know the industry, is that that is a more medium to long term prospect. It is not something that is going to happen in a short order. So in terms of causing problems for the Russian economy, I think this is sort of a 5 to 10 year prospect and not a 6 to 12 months prospect.
Well, with those very judicious words, let's draw to a close, but not before thanking our two terrific speakers, Stephen Wertheim and Hanna Notte. Hope that we'll have a chance for many such conversations in the future, but for teasing out the implications of what's an ongoing, enormously complicated and difficult to figure out situation, I think you've done us all a great service. So thank you so much for coming on to the Kennan Conversations today. To our audience, please keep an eye out for other such conversations. There will be many. in the short to medium term, as we're fond of saying in the foreign policy business, and hope that you'll be tuning into them. But most of all, thanks so much to you both, Hanna and Stephen.
Thank you. Pleasure.